Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our very distinguished panel. Welcome to our viewers. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I am your moderator today. In this webinar, I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panel, after which I will be taking questions from you, the viewers. You can send your questions to dialogues@wto.org. Our webinar today is entitled Food Trade Logistics, Navigating the Risks of COVID-19. It's a joint event of the World Trade Organization and the World Economic Forum. Clearly, the world is experiencing a health crisis, a global pandemic that is pretty much unprecedented in modern times, one that has shut down large parts of the global economy. Unsurprisingly, this shutdown has created bottlenecks for the global food supply chain. This is due to the many measures that have been taken by governments across the globe to quarantine citizens, including food industry workers and farmers, to impose travel restrictions, to suspend non-essential economic activity, and to seal off national borders. Today, many of the world's airports and seaports are continuing to operate at a fraction of their total capacity. Now, in some parts of the world, these restrictions are beginning to ease, but this is very much being done with an eye to a potential second wave of this deadly disease. Similarly, we know that in many other parts of the world, the pandemic has just arrived, and that the lockdowns, the more serious lockdowns, are about to come into place. This webinar will explore the impact of COVID-19 on food trade logistics, asking what we can do to reboot international trade in food and the movement of food across the globe. As you know, international trade feeds 1 in 6 people around the globe, and therefore any disruption to international trade is also a disruption to global food security. With these words, let me hand over to my colleague from the World Economic Forum, Lisa Sweet, who is the head of Future Protein, COVID Response, and Food Health at the Forum, for her opening remarks. Lisa, over to you.
Welcome to everyone, and thank you, Joa, for the work that you have done to convene this series of informative webinars at this most critical time. On behalf of the World Economic Forum, we are pleased to have had the opportunity to collaborate with you on today's discussion. Historic productivity gains and efficiencies in the food sector have resulted in a highly complex and interdependent global system of production and distribution, as it aims to meet the food and nutritional needs of a growing population and the particular tastes of consumers around the world. In recent years, there has been recognition of the necessity of taking a systems approach when it comes to food, ensuring that food systems are not only efficient, but also that they are inclusive, sustainable, healthy, and nutritious. This approach is at the heart of the work that we do within the World Economic Forum's Food System Initiative. Trade facilitation and efficient logistics are critical enablers of supply chain efficiency, allowing food to be produced in regions that make sense and supporting the movement of that food to get to where it needs to be. For those viewers who are drinking coffee right now, I think you'll particularly appreciate this concept. These enablers can also support other aspects of the food systems approach. For instance, providing economic opportunities and minimizing waste. The Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation is a public-private partnership we co-host. It brings together governments and business to implement trade facilitation reforms, including those in support of the food system approach and efficient logistics. Currently, the Alliance is looking at how emergency measures implemented by governments have facilitated or hindered trade, and will co-design projects to amplify trade facilitation in the post-COVID era. And within our supply chain efforts, we are working to initiate a global supply system platform to aggregate data as it pertains to roadblocks in transport of essential food. As we look at the impact of COVID, Joa has posed the question of how we can reboot international trade and logistics for increased resilience. Institutionally across the World Economic Forum, we are discussing the Great Reset. What is the commitment to jointly and urgently build the foundations of our economic and social system for a more resilient future? One that is fair, one that is sustainable. Today's COVID crisis may unfortunately only be a harbinger of future disruptions, disease spread, climate change, or other shocks to the system. Understanding and facilitating the trade and logistics that sit at the heart of the interconnectedness of the global food system is of paramount importance. And we look forward to today's discussion to further inform our collective activities. With that, I am pleased to hand back to Joa and our esteemed panelists today.
Thank you, Lisa. So let me, without further ado, introduce our panel to you. Ertharin Cousin, CEO and President of Food Systems for the Future. She's also the former Executive Director of the World Food Programme. Arnaud Petit is Executive Director of the International Grains Council. Sherry Rosenau, Counselor in the Market Access Division of the WTO in the Trade Facilitation section. Siddhartha Adya is Vice President of Group Cargo Solutions and Platform Development at PSA International. Alan Jorgensen is Head of Sustainable Trade at Merckx. So Ertharin, let me start with you. The World Food Programme recently made headlines with its warning that the world may face famines of biblical proportions very soon. Alarming words. It warned that the coronavirus pandemic could push an additional 130 million people to the brink of starvation. Clearly, the reasons for this are numerous, but prominent amongst them is the logistical disruption to the movement of food. Now, nobody knows more than you about the logistics involved in moving food across the globe from A to B. Could you walk us through these logistics and the additional challenges that COVID-19 represents?
Well, good morning. And first, allow me to thank both WTO and the WEF for including me in today's conversation. You're right. The work that the World Food Programme performs is they serve as the food systems distribution facilitator for the globe. And so spending time there, you have the opportunity to recognize both the opportunities and challenges that are provided by a functioning food system. And if you recall, the 2008-9 food crisis was much about trade embargoes, but the world learned significant lessons from 2008 and 9. And as a result, while in the earliest part of the COVID response, we did witness some limited embargoes in rice in Vietnam and some other countries. We saw slowdowns in India. We still have some controls in place in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Romania. For the most part, the countries of the world recognize that food is, of course, essential. And we have seen the commodities that depend upon the global trading system continue to flow. And that has benefited not just those net exporting countries, but to the life-saving of those net importing countries that depend upon the movements of commodities. The challenges that we see are along that supply chain once it goes from country of origin to country of import, are the processing challenges, the distribution challenges in country, when you have populations on lockdowns. And those shorter supply chains, for example, produce, where even in a place like the United States, you have seen logistics challenges when we have made our food systems more efficient, which makes them, we are learning, less agile. And where that food system is responsible, is that food system primarily supports, for example, in the US, institutions on one side and retail on the other. When institutions close, that impacts the distribution, the processing, and of those commodities that flow through, and those foods that flow through that supply chain. So from the ports to the processors to the storage and warehousing of food, we are seeing a recognition of the need for more warehousing and systems that provide more data and information across the food system to ensure the continuous flow of commodities. And when I talk about the shorter regional and local supply chains, particularly when we look at produce, the lack of access to processing in many countries, and the lack of agility in processing systems. And this is not a developed versus developing world problem. We, again, witness a significant problem in the United States, where we saw farmers plowing under fruits and vegetables, and as a result of lack of access to processing capacity. So the challenge is, we have, and I'll close with this, we have seen a food system that is a food system that is global, where we have overcome many of the challenges in the movement of product from net export to net import in countries, but we have not overcome the challenges of making our food system more efficient and less agile, and the effect that has then on the movement of food from the producers to, as they say, the eaters.
Thank you, Ertharin, for those comments. Indeed, the issue of agile food systems is a very complicated one. We're discovering that with COVID in all areas of international trade. The world is so globalized, supply chains are globalized, and therefore that lack of agility becomes complicated when borders shut. Where do you source your inputs from closer to home? How can you react quickly enough? Where can you store surplus food? So absolutely, I think the word agility was really central to your remarks. Avinoy, let me turn to you. Since the beginning of this crisis, we've been told by multiple international organizations like the FAO that there's no global food shortage. In fact, we've been told that we have had better harvests of some crops than we've had in recent years. But what can you tell us about the ability of grains to move across the globe from A to B, the logistics of the movement of grains, and how those logistics have been impacted?
So when talking about the grains and oilseeds, we have just to bear in mind that in terms of trade, we have not seen a big impact on global trade for the grains. And thanks, I would say, to the decision of the governments, which have put agriculture, but also all the supply chain in exceptions, in the exemption to the COVID-19 measures. For example, in Brazil, in April, they have made record exports. So now soybeans are more exporting than 100 million tons. So which is a massive increase indeed in a year where we see COVID-19 developing and also in this country. The second point important also I would like to say is the volume move, and there is issues in inland transportation. But as when you have so much quantities of grains moving more than 500 million of these tons of commodities moving on, if there is a problem in your inland transportation, you have a problem on the port. The port capacity and storage these commodities is not infinite. So this is why we see that indeed the flow of commodity, even within the country, are moving on now. And I would say the main question we have is for the future is looking forward in terms of demand side, where the demand will move. And particularly for the livestock sector, which has been maybe the most impacted by the COVID-19, is the livestock sector across the world will be able to restart quickly enough, and that may have an impact on the grain sector, because that's 40% of the grain is going to the feed livestock sector. So that's one issue. The second issue, and it is right that FAO and others are telling that supply is not a problem. And thanks, I would say, to the crisis in 2007, 2008, we have now the AMIS G20 initiative, which have been able to provide transparent information about production and supply. The question now is about the demand side and the affordability of these commodities, because we see, particularly in some African countries, highly dependent to oil revenues, how they will be able to continue to purchase that commodities. That's the first point. Second point is about the currency movement. We have seen a huge development, a huge movement in currency, which can have a dramatic impact for some countries. A country like South Africa, just for the rice, indeed, it has an increase by 50%. If you just convert your international price, dollar per ton, in local currency per ton. So there is some question mark, I would say, for the future, where it is difficult for forecaster today to tell you exactly where will be the situation. Nevertheless, if we take the matter of production in the different countries, we still expect that 2021 will see a new record for trade. Therefore, there is a clear message from the members of IGC also to continue to be cautious about trade disruption measures, about limitation export, or about sanitary matters. I think it's very important if we want to keep this resilience which has been built. We need really to keep this flow of commodity dynamic across the world. And I would finish also on one point is what has been, from my point of view, also learning lesson from this crisis. For the first time, we have seen quickly also a dialogue between the public and the private sector. If we have exchanged a lot of information, try to find new solutions to use electronic or the digital trade in order to allow all this trade moving on. And I think we have there have been some very interesting solutions, I would say, to avoid when we have been a total lockdown, having also a freeze of the trade and also all this administrative certification system procedure, which can be burdensome in some times. Now there have been some new approach, and I think it's very, we have seen some opportunities for the future to build resilience in case we would have to face a new crisis like we had in March. Thank you, Dua.
Thank you, Arnaud. So I guess the keywords there are the fall in demand, currency fluctuations, and trade restrictions and distortions. And we must really watch out for those as we go forward for the grain sector and for a lot of other sectors indeed. Siddharth, let me move over to you. Now, you're an expert in cargo solutions, obviously. PSA describes the global supply chain as a team sport. And what this means, according to PSA, is that the movement of goods requires three things. First, the physical movement of goods via air, sea, rail, and warehousing. Second, regulatory flows of customs declarations and all of the other paperwork associated with trade. And three, financial flows involving letters of credit, banking transactions, insurance procedures, and more. Can you explain to us in the area of food how this team sport has been impacted by COVID-19?
Sure. Good evening all, and thank you, Dora, for inviting PSA International and myself to this dialogue. Now, the food sector represents a highly integrated value chain as food typically moves from farm to table, often through fairly complicated web of transactions or interactions. For instance, food produced in one part of the world can be processed and packaged in another and finally consumed across various countries and regions. So a disruption in any one or more areas can create a ripple effect that typically has the ability to paralyze the entire value chain. Now, if we take the last few months as example, we've seen significant disruption across the physical flow of cargo as food-related cargo, as thousands of containers of frozen pork, chicken, and other foodstuffs have been piling up at major ports after COVID-related lockdowns led to restrictions in cargo movements across countries. So ports were functional, but the trucks were not running, and the manpower was not available, and hence cargo could not move from the terminal to inland locations, and due to caused a lot of delays. So, for instance, as congestion issues built up at key ports in China at the start of the year, and carriers started diverting services and capacity, we saw significant container buildup, especially for refrigerated cargo at major transshipment locations across Asia, Singapore being an example, as boxes were discharged there pending further movement. Container dwells, in fact, increased by as much as 50% or more across some of these locations. And what that did in turn was have a negative impact on and created container and equipment shortages in different parts of the world, as food operations, say, in Europe, for example, now have to wait longer for incoming equipment from Asia, and hence saw increased delays in the overall movement of products and handling at that end. We also continue to see a lot of disruption for food product moving via air due to reductions in air capacity that I'm sure we've all heard of, and significantly higher air freight rates, which are almost 4 to 6 times or more higher than normal across key lanes. So suffice to say, the physical supply chain in that sense has been severely strained over the last few months as a result of COVID-related actions across the globe. On the regulatory end, initially we saw countries impose restrictions on exports of certain commodities as part of their food safety plans, notably rice and eggs out of Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. in this part of the world. Plus, we continue to see, as of now, staff shortages across some locations, such as India, for instance, and boxes having to wait longer before they move for customs clearances and trade documentation to happen. So in effect, there is an artificial bottleneck that's been created as a result of that due to perhaps policy misalignment or policies not being coordinated across countries and regions, and regulatory considerations as well. And finally, all of this has had a severe knock-on effect on financial flows by way of additional costs along the supply chain and food wastage along the chain globally. For instance, boxes containing food supplies being abandoned at terminals, or wastage upstream due to a lack of adequate labor in the primary and farm segments. And there are several instances of fresh vegetables and fruits going to waste due to the lockdowns and inadequate infrastructure, especially in the unorganized sectors in India, in Malaysia, etc. And all of this essentially has created a lot of financial stress across the industry as a whole, which then creates its own problems, own set of problems, both upstream and downstream. So essentially, there are a lot of interdependent flows that rely on a process of seamless handoffs from one segment to the next. And once any one area breaks down, the whole process or system essentially gets impacted. So in that sense, as we consider critical areas such as food supplies, one needs to take a holistic view across the chain and ensure all segments are being treated uniformly and policy alignments are being coordinated and need to happen. And hence really the analogy to supply chains being a team sport, wherein in the case of food supplies especially, all key stakeholders from shippers to terminals, shipping lines and logistics providers, and also regulators in the financial sector essentially need to come together to ensure bottlenecks are being addressed and policies are being coordinated so that the chain is not hindered at any point from origin to destination, as we've seen in recent months. So yeah, essentially, I mean, that's where the analogy of being a team sport comes in, to ensure that these handoffs are seamless and the chain keeps moving. And this really depends on a lot of factors, such as regulatory issues, policies, etc., that have come into play.
Thank you, Siddharth. The issue of food wastage is, of course, of incredible concern, and you mentioned containers being abandoned, etc. I think it is only after some time passes, when this crisis is over, that we'll be able to calculate in dollars what the size of that wastage was. And I think it would be interesting to learn from that experience as we go forward. I think it would be important also that we do run these calculations. Alan, I'd like to turn to you on the same set of issues to get the perspective of a big shipping company, Maersk. Now, cargo owners, importers, insurers have been concerned about things like the accumulation of cargo, storage fees as a result of that accumulation, the holdup of ships at ports and their forced rerouting to alternative destinations because of the lockdowns. And what I'd like to get is your perspective on perishables. How has all of this impacted perishables, and what are some of the patterns that you've been seeing?
Yes, thank you, Dora, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join the webinar today. Just about what we are seeing, I mean, as Maersk, we move around 20% of global containerized cargo, and we actually move about 30% of food that is transported in shipping containers. So of course, we have been like everybody else in the team sport, as it were, trying to roll with the punches as this pandemic has sort of shifted through the various geographies where we are active. We are in 130 countries. So I'll just try to talk a little bit about what we have seen in general, and with a particular emphasis on food, what we have tried to do, and maybe also what are some of the lessons that we have drawn from a trade and logistics perspective. First of all, I mean, just going back to when this started unfolding, it started actually as a supply side crisis with the lockdowns in China, where global supply chains reacted by wanting to of course speed up products from China to get them to market. So, but what started as a supply side crisis very quickly and is now a demand side crisis. And the sort of general picture, if you wanted me to sum it up, is that we're basically seeing that supply chains are holding up to this litmus test, that goods are moving in line with demand. That's not to ignore the various congestion issues and local disruptions that have been very severe. But by and large, supply chains have been holding up. When the crisis shifted to a, let's say, a demand side crisis, the emphasis by customers was one of slowing down supply chains, which is not something that we're of course used to. So one of the key bottlenecks for that has of course been storage space. Finding storage at all stages along the supply chain has been key to this effort to really slow down the supply chains in light of this drop in demand. We have said that we expect a drop in volumes in the range of 20 to 25% in Q2, and that's of course completely unprecedented. So a lot of work is being done to sort of adapt to that. But of course, there are some congestion issues and disruptions. I mean, I don't want to sit here without, first of all, mentioning the people on the front line who are actually manning the vessels in the warehouses, in the terminals, without whom this could not be achieved. So all our terminals have been up and running throughout the crisis at less capacity sometimes, but they have been up and running. The vessels have been sailing because of the front line. And actually one of our major challenges now is that many of our seafarers are unable to disembark because countries are not treating them as essential personnel. So globally, about 200,000 seafarers are actually stuck on merchant vessels. Many of them have been there for maybe up to 9 months, which is completely unacceptable. So that is actually one of the major headaches we have at the moment, where we're working through various international bodies to get states to actually take responsibility for resolving that. Then on the equipment side, we've also had to do a lot because many sailings have been blanked. That means that capacity has been taken out of the market. And that means containers that used to be available at export locations are suddenly no longer available, as my colleague from PSA also highlighted. So what we have done there, especially in the food segment, is to actually make sure that we move empty reefer containers to the markets where they're needed in time for the season. So we've moved 2,000 reefer containers recently to South Africa for the citrus season. We moved a similar amount to Brazil. So these are moves that would normally happen in a normal network situation, but because networks are down or reduced in capacity, that sort of equipment shortage happens. That has also been visible in grains, for example, where one of our startup companies, which is called Frey, which is in containerized grains, also has had a very big focus on trying to make equipment available to the customers in that segment. Digital has meant a lot. We wouldn't have been able to say that we're in this situation had it not been for the stage of digitization, and I know we'll come to that later. And lastly, of course, we also feel the difference between now and maybe in 2007-8, that by and large governments have prioritized food supplies, so treating food as essential goods, and that has also been a key factor that we have seen to actually keep food supply chains globally, at least, open. In terms of lessons learned for supply chains, what we're seeing is that the supply chains and the companies that have struggled are supply chains that are predominantly a single source or that run very low inventories. So there is a shift, you can say, from the just-in-time supply chain to the just-in-case supply chain. And that is also something that we're seeing in food as will probably be a major kind of game changer coming out of this crisis.
Thank you very much for these very rich comments. It's interesting that your overall conclusion is that supply chains are pretty much holding up to the litmus test, but that what you didn't expect, of course, was the demand side shock, and therefore the need for the incredible need for storage and warehousing, etc. And indeed, we have been reading about the seafarers stuck at sea, and it is a dramatic situation to know that there are all these people at sea unable to disembark and to get to their homes. It's an extraordinary and very unprecedented situation. Sherry, let me move over to you. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement came into force in 2017. In response to WTO members' recognition that bureaucratic delays and red tape could be a very serious burden for the movement of goods across borders. Can you walk us through what the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement can do for food, in particular perishables, at a time when logistical disruption is so significant?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Doha. You are absolutely right that the aim of the Trade Facilitation Agreement is to reduce barriers and expedite the movement of goods for import, export, and transit. And let me start off by saying first that many people think of it as a customs agreement. However, over half of the provisions must be implemented by all border agencies dealing with trading goods. And the agreement's 37 provisions cover transparency, modernized border control, and border agency coordination. It promotes cooperation between government and private sector through regular consultation and aims to improve fairness and transparency in government decisions and rulemaking. But to give you an idea of how the Trade Facilitation Agreement can operate in practice, let's take a hypothetical. And let's say we want to import food products into a country that is fully implementing the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So first of all, we need some information. A government that is fully implementing the agreement publishes all laws, regulations, duties, fees, and other information, and makes it easily accessible on the internet. And here also the country can publish and update its COVID-19 requirements that are new and ever changing. Agency websites have practical step-by-step guides on the import process and the necessary forms and documents. Additional information can be found through inquiry points. So easy access to information has helped us save time in moving our food products and in finding information about how to import our food products, and we can avoid delays at the border caused by missing information or documentation. Now, in a recent survey that we at the WTO conducted with the International Chamber of Commerce, governments and private sector identified publication and availability of information as of greatest importance in coping with COVID-19. And Arno mentioned that earlier today too. So transparency is clearly important, but so are provisions that can speed up the release of our food products at the border. So I'll mention 5 examples. First, we can pay customs duties and fees electronically and file all import documentation in advance through the single window to enable immediate release when our goods arrive. Second, if we disagree with customs, for example, on our duty rate or classification, our goods can be released under a guarantee rather than sit at the port while we resolve the issue. And this could be especially important now where COVID-19 has created the supply side crisis and a warehouse storage. Third, because we are importing perishable goods, border agencies will give us priority if they need to inspect our goods. And fourth, if there are disputes, we have rights of appeal, including the possibility of retesting samples of our goods. And fifth, border agencies cooperate with each other. For example, all border agencies will inspect and sample at the same time. And border agency cooperation, both national and cross-border, was also identified in our survey as critical to dealing with COVID-19. So this was just a very brief look at the Trade Facilitation Agreement, but I hope it gives you a sense of how full implementation of the agreement can reduce time and cost in moving goods across borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. That was very clear. Indeed, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement is one of the most extraordinary achievements of WTO because there has been a recognition in that agreement that it is not always the tariffs that block the movement of goods, but it can be the red tape, and that can have a more significant impact on trade than an actual tariff that is charged at the border. So it is amazing that members were able to conclude that agreement, and we will come to, I will be asking you further questions about its implementation at a later stage. Earthrin, let me come back to you. Now, many people are not aware of the relationship between food systems and healthcare. In many parts of Africa where the World Food Programme operates, children that fall sick to malnutrition are taken to health centers where they receive nutrient-rich foods like Super Cereal Plus that can be life-saving. Explain to us the dangers involved, in particular to children and nursing mothers, of losing access to these foods in the midst of a pandemic.
Well, thank you again for that question. The most vulnerable in most crises, in many crises, are children. And the challenge of not having access to nutritious food, UNICEF has warned us that 6,000 children could die, an additional 6,000 children could die every day from preventable causes during this COVID-19 period between now and the end of the year. The fact that children, particularly children who suffer from wasting, are more susceptible to infection during COVID, makes their immune systems much more susceptible to disease, and the lack of access to supplemental foods makes them even more vulnerable. The concerns on border closures and food movements require that governments have the ability to pre-position buffer stocks to support essential commodities and micronutrients and the therapeutic foods that these children require in order to avoid the horrific projections that UNICEF has put forth. The other challenge is we have made progress on issues related to stunting. But stunting access, the progress requires regular access to supplemental food, regular access to nutritious food. And when borders close, when households are quarantined or locked down, it limits the ability of mothers to move children to the health systems, to the health centers. And when you have a COVID impact in a developing country, it puts stress on those health centers and makes the personnel, requires personnel to focus on abating the disease of COVID and limits personnel available to support those healthcare needs of mothers and children. We've also seen this is compounded by the misconception of many women that if they have COVID or are susceptible to COVID, that they could pass on the virus to their children. So as the world embraced exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months, mothers have been reluctant to breastfeed. And when there's lack of access to the supplemental foods, as well as mothers limiting their breastfeeding activities, and you don't have personnel to do the coaching that is necessary to support these mothers, you have the potential for the perfect storm in the impact on the health of those children. And I'll just close by saying it's also, we need to think about the lack of access to nutritious foods when borders close of mothers who are pregnant or lactating or breastfeeding, and the impact that that has on the micronutrient deficiencies of the child. in the stunting situation and in a wasting situation, the impact on the potential of life-saving for that child when the mother cannot breastfeed and there is no access to the supplemental foods. So what started as a viral health challenge becomes a crisis in a crisis of a food challenge that is even more exacerbated by the weakness of children who suffer from malnutrition, particularly wasting, and even those who suffer from stunting.
Thank you very much, Ertharin. Indeed, ingredients there for a perfect storm, as you've just said. And of course, most people can't know about these issues if they don't have the sort of field experience that you do. These are details that people just don't pay attention to unless they're working for humanitarian organizations. And the impact is indeed dramatic because so many different things are interconnected. Arnaud, I'd like to come back to you. We know that the International Grains Council held the International Grains Conference just yesterday. Can you walk us through the principal findings of that conference and your projections for grain markets?
Yes, thank you, Doa. Indeed, we had a conference with more than 380 participants from the grain value chain and across the world. And I would say the feeling is they're not expecting a major disruption for the grains market, grains and oilseeds market for the next marketing year. But I would like to bring the idea of a support team in a way that they are still looking along the value chain. And if the food demand is not coming back as usual, is there one part of the grain value chain can be a weakest point and create a systemic problem? So that's something we have to look, I would say, for the future. The second point is for the trading houses. Now they have a question to manage, to handle and to manage is the health for the workers. And I think that's something they are really looking for and try to get now new guidance for all the trading houses in order to secure the health of the workers. Because behind that, then it is the health for the consumer. So they have to handle it, and I think it was a big message. The third message, we discussed a lot about the export restrictions, but I think now there is among the governments, and I would say most probably this board will then end up in WTO discussion, is the support to the farming community and to the food system. We have seen, particularly in OECD country, interim support for the farming sector or for the food system and how it will end up. Is it now just a short-term period support, or it will become a new era in terms of support to the farming community? So that's something also to look for the future. And the last point I would like to mention is about logistics and ports. There is a lot of investment looking forward. Dry bulk transportation before was really reliable on coal economy and moving this coal to country. And it seems that the dry bulk terminals are looking to shift from this, I would say, this business, which is less and less incentive due to climate change approach, and to try to see if they can turn these terminals into to host grains. You have an example in Mozambique, for example, where there is a dry bulk terminal for coal, which is moving to grains, and which will give some opportunity on this flexibility or agility, I would say, of the global trade to handle these different hurdle or crisis in the future. I would say that's the main point. And we discussed also about climate change. I think we have to bear in mind that climate change is there despite the crisis, and we have discussed a lot of initiatives from the traders, but also from the input industry. And the most important thing for the future is how to get a consistent approach, I would say, during these different actors within the grain value chain. So that's the different points we discussed during the grain value chain, the grain conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaud. Yes, in fact, I watched many parts of the grains conference online yesterday, and I would certainly advise our viewers, if they're interested in grains, to do so. Lots of messages emerging from that conference, and of course, the one you mentioned on the health of workers is absolutely key. Siddharth, let me come back to you. PSA International is saying that the next phase of the COVID pandemic can be called a reboot, an attempt to reopen the global economy cautiously. And to exercise that caution, it says that the world will need to navigate what it calls the 4 R's. These are recession, resilience, regionalism, and reform. Can you walk us through those R's, please?
Sure. Thank you, Dor. Now, I guess as we as PSA and as we all chart our way forward, there are many unknowns, given that we have yet to fully understand the extent of disruption faced by global economic systems during the COVID-related lockdowns. So in the midst of rebooting or restarting the global economic engine, we need to be watchful of, as we've termed them, the 4 R's of recession, resilience, regionalism, and reform. Now, if you talk about recession, I think with major industries having been severely impacted and as unemployment pressures rise, consumption will likely remain sluggish in the medium term. Therefore, trade-dependent businesses, especially like ours, must be prepared to navigate through this negative cycle. Businesses will need to plan ahead in terms of services and capabilities to better manage the post-COVID phase and hopefully come out stronger. Now, for example, for us, this means an increased emphasis on digitalization and adoption of new technologies across our operations. That will hopefully then allow us to better integrate with our business environment and also our broader stakeholder community. Talking about resilience, I think by definition, resilience requires flexibility and the ability to adapt and innovate. And to ensure we address the right issues, for instance, so we've, as PSA, have stepped up our engagements with governments and customers alike to understand their challenges and work with them as we move forward to shape win-win and, more importantly, sustainable solutions in the area of food security, for instance. Regionalism, again, as supply chains realign and look to mitigate geographic risks moving forward from recent experiences. We expect to move towards more regional and cluster-driven manufacturing and consumption models, for which new services and infrastructure would be needed. Through our focus and investments, for example, in intermodal handling, digital infrastructure development, and cross-border products such as sea-air facilitation for food supplies, for instance, we continue to position ourselves as facilitators to support increased integration and across regional supply chains. And then finally, reform, as we all face new realities and a different pace of change, this calls for a reformation in terms of how businesses engage across the broader environment and also with each other. Now, one example would be how, for instance, we as supply chain players share and govern data exchanges across key end-to-end nodes or flows. So essentially addressing what needs to be changed in the system as a whole and not just individually or at the fringes, so that we can create a more sustainable ecosystem overall. And that kind of sums up the 4 R's as we see them, and based on our outlook as we sort of move forward into the post-COVID future.
Thank you very much. Indeed, those 4 R's are what the entire world will need to focus on going forward. They create a very useful framework for thinking about logistics and international trade in the COVID era. Alan, I'd like to come to you. Maersk has seen its reliance on e-commerce rise significantly during the pandemic. On your website, you say, and I quote, "As the pandemic hit, more people began working from home and customers are seeing the convenience of going online to manage their logistics business using the Maersk mobile app. In the first 5 weeks of 2020, the Maersk app averaged 70,000 business transactions per week. By mid-April, it had grown to 130,000 business transactions weekly, reflecting an almost 90% increase in the use of this tool. Can you tell us about COVID and its impact on e-commerce and digitalization?
Yes, thank you, Do. I think that's an extremely relevant question for the discussion here, and I'll try to give some examples. But first of all, like we have seen across other industries in the COVID crisis, it's really the digital leaders who are being rewarded. That goes for the software that we're communicating through now, but also in logistics and shipping. Logistics and shipping is not a very cutting edge industry when it comes to digitization. There's still a culture in consumer behavior around doing things the old-fashioned way. So digitization is high on our agenda in Maersk, and we have seen the response to that during the COVID crisis. So the online platforms that we have now, Maersk.com, is seeing a growth that we have not experienced in the past. And that reflects, of course, the need to keep the wheels running during the global lockdown. So the investments that we have made and other actors in the industry have made, we think have been crucial in actually keeping trade moving at this time. One example of that, I mentioned before that Maersk is a big player in refrigerated shipping. We have 400,000 refrigerated containers in our network. And up until just a couple of years ago, they were not connected digitally. But now they are. We're able to actually manage them remotely from a computer. And during the lockdown, we had about 40,000 staff working from their homes. We had a big staff shortage in our container freight stations. And what happens when a refrigerated container starts its journey is that it needs to be inspected to make sure that the equipment is functional, that it's up and running, so that you can keep your perishables safe during the journey. There was no staff during COVID to actually handle that volume. So what we were able to do is to actually conduct those inspections online. So we had our staff sitting in their homes with their laptops, actually capable of doing that remotely. And that would not have been possible 2 years ago only. So that's an example of how behind the scenes also the digitization is really moving us to a different place, not just during COVID, but in general. We are also digitizing the global shipping ecosystem together with the other container carriers in a platform called TradeLens, which is an attempt to basically bring shipping information online onto a common platform so that all the ecosystem can share the data in real time and have access, so as to say, to the same version of the truth. And we've also seen a remarkable growth in the interest in that type of solution. So right as we speak, we're actually launching a global collaboration with UNCTAD and supported by the government of Germany to make the TradeLens ecosystem available to developing and emerging economies who are using the Asecuda customs management system, so that hopefully in a couple of years' time we will be able to allow these countries to leapfrog to the cutting edge of logistics technology, as it were. So those are some of the efforts that we have already been working on that have we believe made supply chains more resilient to the kind of shock that we're seeing now. But that journey has really just begun, and I think will be greatly accelerated by what we have seen here.
Thank you, Alan. Indeed, the shipping industry is not the only old-fashioned industry, as you put it. Many industries and organizations are discovered just how old-fashioned they have been, given the technology that we now have at our disposal. Just looking at this meeting that we're having on Zoom with each one of us in a different part of the world. Indeed, COVID is an opportunity now to leap into the digital era, for which we are technologically prepared in many ways. Sherry, let me come back to you. Estimates show that the full implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement could reduce trade cost by about 15% and boost global trade by about $1 trillion per year, with the biggest gains going to the poorest countries. Can you talk to us about how this agreement is being implemented and whether developing countries are being given assistance to do so?
Yes, thank you, Doa. And as you mentioned earlier, the Trade Facilitation Agreement entered into force in February 2017. However, developing and least developed countries can decide when they will implement each provision of the agreement. In order for them to take advantage of this flexibility, a country must notify the implementation date for each provision and provide a description of any implementation assistance needs. But fortunately, these notifications are all available on WTO websites, so you can find out when each provision will be implemented in the countries where you do business. Now, based on these notifications that we have received to date, we can estimate that the current status of implementation of the agreement globally is at 66%. Now, this includes developed countries implementing at 100%. Developing countries are implementing at a rate of 65%, and the least developed countries at a rate of 33%. Now, as to donor support, WTO developed members are providing implementation assistance through their national aid agencies and/or providing funding for programs conducted by international or regional organizations and the regional development banks. Many developing countries and private sector are also providing a great deal of assistance. The WTO has a trade facilitation agreement facility that can help members find the appropriate assistance. Now, this implementation assistance responds to the particular needs of each country and commonly takes the form of training, government officials and private sector, development of laws and procedures, implementation of IT systems, and possibly even financial support. Now, during COVID-19, of course, providing assistance is much more challenging. But the aid agencies and organizations are making good use of technology to provide training through video conferences, e-learning courses, webinars, and enhancing information available online. So everybody's coping the best they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. So these are interesting statistics. So the developing world at 65% and LDCs at 33%. But as you mentioned, of course, this agreement only came into force in 2017. So let's hope that more progress is made, but that's already a significant achievement. I'd like to hand over now to the World Economic Forum for this next segment of the webinar, the questions from the viewers, and indeed many questions have come in. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience for these fabulous questions, of which we have the opportunity to go through a few of them. We would ask our speakers to keep their comments to 2 to 3 minutes each in response to these for this round. Earthrin, turning to you first. You have spoken and shared your knowledge and expertise on humanitarian logistics, and currently you are involved in leadership and innovation for the future food systems. We've heard from a number of the speakers on the call today around technology enhancements, and viewers are wondering around your view on what is the potential for agritech and innovation to support greater agility of food logistics.
we look at the challenges that have been described as we look at the challenges that have been described by all of the speakers in the various aspects of the logistics system, the need for data and technologies that make data sharing and data management more robust are going to rise to the front. The new technologies around labor management. We talk about labor shortages, the need for different labor training, particularly in the processing arenas where we've seen increase in COVID cases, where the present practices in processing, how do we change those processes through labor management, blockchain as to support shipment tracking and transport, the ability to use data to support the inventory management and traceability and more accurate and reliable information regarding the movement of commodities and foodstuff through the logistics system. One of the questions that I'm hearing often across both the public and private sector is platforms for interoperable platforms for the sharing of data, not just across supply chains, but also across actors in the food system. As we move from more of a supply-driven to a demand-driven food system, the ability for that information to move efficiently from consumer and retailer back to producer is going to become ever more important, and using tools like digitization to support that activity. The bottom line is one of the challenges that someone like myself who's a humanitarian is concerned about is these new tools, whether it's ag tech or more innovation tools coming online, are coming online for more affluent farmers, more affluent consumers, and more affluent operators across the food system. Our challenge is, how do we ensure the access to less affluent, more vulnerable farmers, producers, and actors across the food system to ensure that we don't create even more disparity in the food system as new technologies come online.
Thank you, Earthren. And I think that's a great balance that you have just put out there, managing the opportunities that the technology provides and the need to create these technologies in a holistic perspective so they're interconnected, but then also recognizing that they can't be developed unless they have that inclusionary aspect to them and help those all throughout the ecosystem to come along in the process that they built. Alan, turning over to you, many viewers are asking if this crisis should lead us to shorten supply chains, to reshore production, and create strategic stockpiles of various food. Is this a route that you would recommend in response to COVID-19?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question also as we look towards recovery. There are certainly lessons learned, as I indicated earlier, in terms of supply chains that are single source, run low inventories, rely very much on speed to market, have proven more vulnerable through this crisis than others. However, we need to look at it in a bigger picture, where you can say factors involving around the geopolitics, new technologies, changing online consumer behaviors are working, you can say, alongside external shocks, like in this case, a pandemic, in the future, maybe a physical impact of climate change, to reshape the kind of, you can say, risk opportunity trade-off that companies are gonna see and be looking at when they design their supply chain. So overall, it's very difficult across the board in sectors to predict where that will go. But the overall kind of common denominator is you will need more redundancy. You will be needing more agility in your supply chain. That doesn't necessarily mean less supply chain. It may mean more supply chain. As I indicated, supply chains in the COVID crisis have been a shock absorber, not a liability. So the better connected we are as companies and also countries and food markets, the more resilient we are to these types of shocks that are likely to be more prevalent in the future. What we would definitely like to warn about is to draw conclusions from some of the more focused problems we have had in relation to essential medicines and PPE on the back of COVID, and kind of extrapolate that to mean that we have to become more self-sufficient across the board. That would definitely be a move in the wrong direction in terms of both poverty reduction and resilience going forward. We have to also, I think, look in the bigger picture that COVID hit us actually at a time when global trade was already slowing down. The global economy was in sort of late cycle, and we have actually all since the global financial crisis seen a protracted period of rising protectionist measures, especially since 2017. So we think it's very important to have now a discussion in terms of rebooting and resetting, also looking at those more fundamental issues. We've heard the World Bank indicate that COVID may roll back decades of improvements in poverty reduction. If we are to bounce back from that, we need open trade and we need supply chains to function. So we really need this sort of open rules-based discussion to be part of the recovery discussion as well. As looking at those finer factors of building more resilient supply chains.
Thank you, Alan. I think a real clear message there for open borders, open trade, and an understanding that the supply chain can play this critical factor as a shock absorber, as you said, during these crisis times. Siddharth, coming over to you. We've spoken a bit on this call already about cold storage and the backups that have happened at the ports that you've seen, resulting from some of the labor issues on the back end of that. There are also reports that demand for cold storage space in Europe has surged after bars and restaurants and sports venues and many of those other venues have closed, and leaving suppliers hunting for places to store their unsold food that needs that refrigeration to prevent waste. Many are saying that it's nearly impossible to find that commercial fridge and freezer space. Viewers are asking if warehousing is likely to be a growth industry in the future, and we're wondering how this is factored in regard to those seamless handoffs that are needed amongst the supply chain that you referenced earlier.
I think that's a good question. I think first off, as it relates to warehousing and storage, as we see realignments across supply chains and perhaps as I talked about earlier about manufacturing and consumption becoming perhaps more regional or more cluster driven, by default, I think that will drive the need for more storage, especially as I think what we'll see is more hubs coming up where as companies try and get more control over their upstream flows by way of raw materials or intermediate flows, where these products will come in, get hubbed, and then distributed out to perhaps clusters of manufacturing or clusters of factories or distribution clusters from where they get distributed out to the final audience. So I certainly believe that the need for storage and warehousing will go up. But I would caveat that by saying that I think the need will be more focused on smart warehousing and perhaps smart storage structures, which is not just a four-walled warehouse, but something that is able to integrate across the broader supply chain. And to that extent, I think technology platforms that help better manage inventory and then also give the right kind of milestone-based visibility to various players, I think will get more emphasized. So certainly a need for storage important, but smart storage by way of the right kind of technology coming into play. And I think we're already seeing a lot of emphasis on that. Yeah, so I guess I would end at that. So definitely, I think storage and the right technology coming together to perhaps optimize supply chains and make them more visible and more flexible to further shocks in times, I guess, if we do see any.
Great, and thank you. I think what you're calling attention to here is the ecosystem that's needed. So we can't have one without the other. We can grow the warehousing, the storage, but only if we do so in a smart way, leveraging the technologies and bringing in the actors that need to be part of that entire system growth or that entire cluster growth, as you so eloquently said. Arnaud, coming over to you. You mentioned that at your conference, the issue of climate change was there. Many viewers are inquiring about the impact of this other crisis on the grain sector, the climate crisis. Do you foresee major disruptions to the grain sector as climate change gains speed? And how do you go on, as you mentioned earlier, to get and create that consistent approach?
Thank you for the great question indeed. Because when we look about the impact of climate change, we have always two views. So we know that some part of the world are facing more and more constraints in relation to natural resources and water scarcity. We mentioned particularly the MENA area where we see more and more difficulties, and in that way the short chain is a big challenge for that region. But if you look closely to that region, the Black Sea area, indeed, the climate change has improved the yield in that region, and we have seen less and less weather a dramatic event in relation to the production of grains. So, if we look in the last 2 decades, indeed, we have increased by 1,000 million tons the total grains of production across the world, and just in the last decade, it was more than 552 million tons. So we have not this vision as the climate change is limiting the production. We have to bear in mind that genetics has improved tremendously in the crop sector. The second point I would like to highlight is, I think the climate change, all the value chain is taking that point to answer to the consumers concretely when he's buying a product, what is the impact on climate change, on biodiversity. And I would say today this is a big challenge. You have some companies which are looking specifically on carbon footprint, when others are looking on biodiversity or country landscape. So, and that's now, I would say, is how we can get all the value chain talking in the same, having the same wording, the same language. I think that's the best. And if all the value chain is able to do so, then maybe we will see all the investments, and I'm talking here about the trade finance, also coming in and financing, and then you can have a snowball effect on that matter. So this is why it was very important to listen that companies that they are still working on climate change, they are not putting aside despite the economical crisis or the challenges they are facing on the market. Now I would say really is how they can work together to ensure to have a concrete results to the consumers. That's, I would say, the main point I would like to highlight in relation to climate change and grain sector.
Thank you, Arnaud. I think it's inspiring to know that the issue of climate change has not fallen off the radar of companies and organizations because it is so critical to the future. Moving over to Sherry, A question came from the academic community. Is there any discussion taking place at the WTO right now on expanding the trade facilitation agreement?
Thank you, Lisa. Try it again. Well, right now, the focus in the Trade Facilitation Committee is on assisting the developing and least developed members to implement the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Am I on? Yes. And I imagine this might intensify to help these developing and least developed countries cope with the crisis. But this is a common question. So is it possible to expand the agreement? Well, these are uncertain times, but normally members will not reopen negotiations on an agreement. Remember that it took members 9 years to negotiate the agreement and 3 years for it to enter into force. But some WTO agreements have been clarified or expanded through a ministerial decision, so that is possible. And also members frequently begin discussions on new topics at the WTO. So it's quite possible that some new areas could have some trade facilitation components, like currently there's a working group on e-commerce. But let me also just mention that the provisions of the agreement were drafted to allow flexibility in how they are implemented. So it is up to each member on how ambitious they want to be. And most donors are very willing to support members that want to go beyond the scope of the trade facilitation agreement. And the whole goal of this is to facilitate trade, not to implement an agreement. So really now I think the focus is to help the developing and least developed members to take advantage of the support that they will get through the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. I think it's great that to hear that the trade agreement was drafted to allow for that flexibility, to allow for that agility, and particularly as you highlight the amount of time it took to get this agreement off the ground, having that as a buffer to aid in future disruptions is particularly helpful. We've done a great job with time management. We're going to come to Siddharth for one final question that perhaps closes the loop with some comments that were made earlier, reflections that were made earlier. Some of our viewers have read the recent articles in the Financial Times around shipping crews stranded at sea. And in fact, Joa and one of you had also referenced this earlier in the call. There are apparently up to 400,000 crews stranded at sea or at home by travel restrictions. The Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping has called this a ticking time bomb. What are your views on this?
I think we do agree with that assessment that this is certainly a major area of concern because and needs to be addressed soon before I guess actions overtake policy. So to that extent, I think we would agree that action needs to be taken. And we have, for that matter, been engaging with respect to at least the locations where we're prevalent, engaging with respective agencies to see how this can be done in an orderly manner or managed more effectively. We have, on our part at least, put up structures or created a framework to, or rather, a process to manage crews coming in or going out where possible. So to that extent, I mean, this is a concern and something that we have been engaging on, and we certainly are looking to see how we can hopefully get an early resolution to this. Because if a resolution is not forthcoming, then I think action may precede that, which then tends to be a bigger concern.
Thank you. And maybe we could turn over to Alan for the same question and your final reflections on that.
I think it's a very good note to end on because these are actually the people that keep everything moving, and they normally do not recognize or get the recognition that they deserve. So I think in this particular situation, they are the last people that we should let down. And unfortunately, they are being let down. And I agree completely with Siddharth that flag that the red flag we are raising now, shipping lines, is that if there is no response from governments very, very soon, we may see unilateral action that can actually throw a spanner in the works of global trade at the moment where we need things to be as operational as possible. So these are individuals who are away from their families, who have no certainty of what the future holds, and also incoming crew who do not have the income that they need to sustain themselves. So this is a very serious situation that we need to make everybody aware of, and especially the member states of the IMO.
I think, thank you for that additional comment. And I think this round of questions, how you've just closed it, circles back nicely to how Earthrin had opened this round of questions with the need for technology, and particularly noting that technology can help for labor, can help paint the better picture of where the labor is, and also can help to connect, if we do it in the right way, the most vulnerable within the system. Joa, I'm going to hand over to you for your final concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to each and every one of our panelists. I know that Lisa and I have certainly learned a tremendous amount through this webinar. It's been incredibly enlightening. And I think for me, what has really struck me here is that supply chains, contrary to popular perception, have not collapsed as a result of COVID-19. In fact, they seem to be surviving COVID-19 quite nicely despite the challenges, and there are challenges, but there are also lessons being learned. And it's interesting that on this episode, supply chains, long supply chains, have been described as a shock absorber, and that perhaps we need more supply chains and not less. So I think these are all very interesting comments for further reflection. A key word in this discussion has been agility, how to build agility into the logistical systems moving forward. So let me thank you all, and let me thank the World Economic Forum for partnering with the WTO to do this webinar. Please stay in touch, and viewers, please continue to log on to Trade Dialogues on Food. Our next episode is in 2 weeks. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.